again on behalf of Emanu-El. I'm not on behalf of Emanu-El. Am I disempowering your ability to unmute yourself? I'm welcoming everyone into our room, despite the fact that I've just disempowered you. But in order to enable ongoing conversation, and we want to make as much as we can of this last window of time we have together in this series with Josh, we have allowed everybody, you could chat with and co-host and host. So if you have questions or comments along the way, please feel free to just put them in the chat. And other bits of business. If you're finding that the connection is running a little slowly, as we found sometimes in the past, you might notice I will shut down your video. It seems to allow us to have a faster speed if everyone has their videos off. So if we're doing fine, I'll leave them on, but otherwise don't be surprised. It's not that I don't like looking at your beautiful face, but that it enables conversation actually a little more effectively. And with that, we should have many, many good opportunities to be in conversation and be together. I am going to turn the floor over to the head of Arts Canada, our own Lee Weiser, to do the introductions.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's a pleasure to be here again and to welcome you in this final session. After we've had the crash course in the history of the conflict, we're going to get down to the present time and hopefully get a chance to answer some of your questions about what's going on now and what might be possible for the future. Our presenter again is Josh Scharf, who is a rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. He's also pursuing his master's degree in Jewish history at the Hebrew University, and he works as the Development Resource and External Relations Coordinator at Beit Daniel Synagogue in Tel Aviv. Josh, thank you for being with us and for helping us expand our understanding and our knowledge about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lee. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. It's great to see those of you that I can, and just to know that you're all here is it's a great privilege for me. As mentioned, we're going to be focusing very much on today, and hopefully some of the the burning topics and questions that you have sent my way over the past week. Everything that I'll be discussing today has been made from questions that have been sent to me over the last few weeks. Just so you know, I did take some narrative liberties. If people ask similar questions, sometimes I brought them together, or if they were all around a similar topic, I've consolidated. I beg your pardon. So just so that we can get to as much as possible and discuss the issues of the day, and in that spirit, I invite you all to again, as I encourage you the first time, to take off your North America glasses and to allow yourself to be challenged and to plunge into a different context in a different part of the world. I invite you to continue to ask questions. Please type them in the chat as we go. They'll pop up on my end and I'll get to them as quickly as possible. Yeah, so putting it mildly, we're meeting in a very different world than we were two weeks ago. And I thought it would be appropriate to take maybe 4 or 5 minutes here to just sort of put the context of the events happening in Europe right now, what's going on here, and how that news is being, received. So it's been an interesting place that Israel has been put into diplomatically and politically. I don't know if anyone has woken up this morning to the push notifications, the news that the Prime Minister Bennett has offered to be a source for mediation between Ukraine and Russia today. Israel is actually one of the only countries that has a working relationship with the governments of both nations. And so that seems to be at least on the table. We'll see how that goes over the next few days. But even from the beginning, beyond the good relationships, even from the beginning, from Thursday, we saw that it was very different messages from the same Israeli government. On one hand, the foreign minister Lapid came out and condemned Russian actions, while on the same day, the Prime Minister Bennett, in a speech to graduates of the commander's course from the IDF, shared his, my heart is with the Ukrainian people, without mentioning Russia. And obviously these are, the political and diplomatic games that politicians and governments do in situations like this. But it's an interesting because the Lapid's message condemning Russian aggression was the first negative statement that Israel has made publicly about Russian policy since 2009. Why is this? Why has Israel been in lockstep, or at least in not willing to openly condemn Russian action? It can be easily understood when we zoom out from Israel, we look at the area, and just to our north, the nation of Syria, which has been engulfed in civil war for over a decade now. The Russian government, the Russian military, really controls what's happening there. And so with their presence so close to the Israeli border, and Israel's desire to continue operating in Syrian airspace to stop weapons and supplies being sent from Iran to their allies operating in the area, Israel's political and security interests align with maintaining those relationships with Russia. Here within Israel, there's been reaction, like the people, there was a huge, the largest, one of the rabbis who works in the Daniel Centers, this conglomerate of synagogues that I work for, is originally from the former Soviet Union. And he said in his 30 years in Israel, I guess he said he's been here, he's never seen a gathering of so many Russian speakers, and what he meant was both Russians and Ukrainians on the streets of Tel Aviv protesting the war, which has been very interesting. The press has been very critical about sort of the two voices from one government, and there's been a lot of op-eds both in the English language Israeli press, but also the Hebrew Israeli press, where journalists and thinkers have really been harping the message that Israel needs to remember that when conflict comes, Israel does stand alone. It's nice that Western politicians. We just had a congressional delegation operated by AIPAC arrive here in Israel. Both Republican and Democrat Congress men and women spent several days here. But at the end of the day, the point of these op-eds being that Israel needs to fend for itself. And in the context of the broader conflict, our subject at hand, there's no doubt that with the events happening internationally, that the focus of the international world, the international community, is solidly elsewhere. There was very little momentum moving towards, bilateral discussions or peace talks of any sort of time. Even last week there wasn't momentum for this, but now that reality has been exacerbated by the crisis at hand. And certainly won't be a big motivator for any side, Israelis, Palestinians, or internationally. This doesn't, I beg your pardon, push them to up the momentum towards something. So while of course the events of today are gripping and difficult, I want to shift away from that. I just wanted to offer a little bit of context for Israel during these times, and I want to bring us back to today. And I want to bring our focus back to the conflict, the particular conflict that's the center of our discussion these past weeks. It's one of the things that I've been rediscovering as I've been reading and rereading sources, both Israeli and Jewish from around the world, is what seems to me, as we tell the story over and over again, is that there's such a range and difference of experience for Jews today, my generation, the generation younger than I, than in previous years. When we look back, 50, 70, 100 years ago, I think there were several more collective experiences that really brought that Jews from different places around the world could really connect to. And I think where we sit today, where 80% of Israeli Jews are born here in the state of Israel. You know, obviously a huge percentage of Jews living in North America are born and live their entire lives there. And I think that those difference in experiences, right, where Israelis don't know what it is to be a minority, and where Jews from the diaspora don't know what it is to be part of the majority, I find that sometimes our conversations are talking across each other because the lived experience and the actual political realities of both are significantly different one from the other. So that was just a thought of context before we dive into today. But what I wanted to do is I organized them by question. So I'll pose the question and then I'll just answer this. This first one was a clarifying question for someone sent in. That does when I use Eretz Israel, right, the land of Israel. What am I referring to? Does that have borders? What does that mean? When I use the word Eretz Israel when I'm teaching, it's purposely to not take a political position on borders of the modern state. When I use the word in my teaching, it's all of what is Israel today, including the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights. Just to sort of, it's a wider political or really geographical space. It sort of includes all of the angles and all the places which the conflict and the story that we're telling is taking place on. Okay, so to our first question here. One moment. Sorry for the technical difficulty. Maybe I'll just do this quickly. Okay, so just very quickly on your screen, just to give context to the question before I dive in. Where were Arab refugees after 1948? When did they become Palestinians? Why were Arab refugees unable to establish themselves in other countries as other victims of war or persecution have? Do Israeli citizens have a general attitude of mistrust or ambivalence towards the Palestinians? Or is there a spectrum of feeling amongst the Israeli population? What are the politics of 1948 Arabs? So a lot of questions here regarding both Arab refugees, Palestinians, and then the relationships between Palestinians and Israelis today. So we will dive into that now. So the Arab refugees after 1948 are spread all over the Middle East, including the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The vast majority that fled their homes, were forced out of their homes, left because they felt necessity to leave, which all happened during the 1948 war, the War of Independence, were placed in refugee camps that today in many places have morphed from refugee camps into cities, right, that are connected to at various levels across different countries of public services, water, electricity, all these sort of things. Goes from it's very it's a huge range of how these places look today, and specifically in those countries that have seen a lot of upheaval in the last decade, Lebanon and Syria. The conditions of some of these places are still quite poor, and there are also gaps, of course, within these societies that have been built over these last 70 years. There are gaps where there are wealthier people in these places, there are poorer people in these places, there are internal disagreements, political, familial, and so these are all, worlds unto themselves, and they all take on different forms and functions depending where they're located throughout the Middle East. So the second question was, talk a little bit about how this group of people becomes Palestinians. Why are they referred to as Palestinians today? So it's a great question. The name Palestine, it originates from the Romans at the end of the Second Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire, the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Romans renamed the territory of what was called Judea, right, the land of the Jews, and they rename it as Palestina. which the Romans took from the greatest enemy of the Jews from the Bible, which was the Philistines, and renamed the territory to erase the Jewish story here. That word enters into Arabic. Palestina from Latin enters into Arabic as Palestine, which is still how it's referred in Arabic today, and how it's still referred to colloquially in this way. So before Israel, before there are states here, before modern borders are set, everyone who lives in this area calls themselves a Palestinian, right? If you were living in Ottoman Palestine, you were a Palestinian Jew, you're a Palestinian Arab. If you were in British Mandate Palestine, you were a Palestinian Jew. The name of the, beg your pardon, the name of the Jewish, I don't know if it's football or soccer north of the border, you'll forgive me. But that they were called Maccabi Palestina. That's because that's what the territory was called. Of course, after the foundation of the state is when this diverges, because Israelis no longer call themselves Palestinian Jews; they call themselves Israelis. For the most part, there's also Jews living here that don't consider themselves Israelis, but that's a topic for another time. And the Arabs continue with this name of Palestinian after the area, and this is how they become known as a people. And this is a group of people that, while there were differences among them in different clans and factions amongst these people, what they do share are similar cultural traits. Speaking of language, they're 99.9% of Palestinian Arabs, Muslims, are Sunni Muslims. There's also a Christian population, but it's much, much smaller. And a collective, they also share a collective memory, which traces the origins of who they are back to the Arabian Peninsula, back to the Bedouin tribes who wandered into this area together with the Muslim conquest, or in the wake of the Muslim conquest. Another part of the Palestinian identity is modern displacement. We spoke about Nakba in our second session together, the catastrophe and the refugee crisis, and people away from their homes and the hope of return. It's a big motivator and a big part of collective identity today. But that's, so we go from everyone living in this area as Palestinians, right, into now we have a state of Israel, and Palestinian comes to describe the Arabs who were living here before the state of Israel was founded in 1948. Another part of the question was talking about Palestinians in other countries, right? Why haven't the Palestinians been able to, in the wake of war, which we've seen in other groups of people, make lives in other countries? And then, okay, a question from Nate. Thank you for stopping me. Was there ever a Palestinian passport? And what was its nationality? There's never a functioning state or a State Department that would issue passports recognized by the rest of the world. It's an interesting question if during the British Mandate, I would need to get back to Rabbi Landsberg about this, if there was a passport issued to under the British, or if it was some other sort of document. I do know that for Jews, there was a Aliyah document given out, and I don't know if that serves as a travel document. It's an excellent question, but no, most Palestinians today, if they hold a passport, which I think is just over 50% of Palestinians, like West Bank Palestinians, their passport is Jordanian. And I don't know enough to say the rules as to why that is the case. So if we're already speaking about Jordan and other countries, pertaining to Palestinians, Palestinians that have moved to different countries in the world have faced a vast range of different experiences. Those who've immigrated, for example, to the United States, to Europe, Chile has a surprisingly large Palestinian community. All of these individuals have been given full citizenship, which means they receive full civil rights. And they get to enjoy with, the challenges and the gifts that these societies present to them. Also in Jordan, Palestinians have full civil rights. The only Arab nation to extend all of its Palestinian residents full citizenship and civil rights in their country. In the rest of the Arab world, it's been a very different experience. In 1965, the Arab League, a group of Arab nations, Arab and Muslim nations that come together to make policy, they made a decision not to grant, as a group, not for no one nation to grant citizenship to the Palestinians, because this would, in their view, harm the claim for Palestinian right of return in the newly created, or I guess at that point, the not quite yet 20 years old state of Israel. For example, Saudi Arabia does not grant citizenship to Palestinians, although it is notoriously difficult to get citizenship. If you're not born Saudi, then it's very difficult to get citizenship regardless. In Lebanon, Palestinians have no civil rights in Lebanon. It was just reported last week in a government policy was renewed that does not allow Palestinians to work in law, engineering, or medicine in Lebanon at all. They're not allowed to work in those fields, and they're not allowed to buy land. Which keeps them in the refugee camps, which obviously makes things very difficult. Syria, we mentioned, there was a population of more than 550,000 Palestinians before the civil war. About almost 1/5 of them have fled from Syria to Europe and other places around the world. Another 5,000 were killed during that conflict, at least. Obviously, these are numbers that we can only partially, we should look at them with a lot of skepticism, because if their source is the Syrian government, there's a lot of questions about where the truth is behind those numbers. And there's sort of there's a very legitimate question of, but why did they leave them like this? Why have Palestinians been left to these experiences? We have the talking point of retaining the right to return, right? By allowing, if we make Palestinian citizens in our country, then the argument that they should be allowed to go back to where they came from is then weakened. Perhaps it's more cynical of me, but I also think that there's a measure of that. If they're not citizens of the country, that the country feels no obligation to provide them. Certainly, if you can't vote, which there's at least a nominal democracy in some of these places, if you don't have any sort of civil rights and you can't participate fully in society, then you can't demand from those who govern you change, which makes Palestinians' life very, very difficult. Okay, Israeli attitudes was asked as part of this question towards Palestinians, and it's a wonderful question, and it's a very, very, very broad spectrum. There are true partnerships between Israeli and Palestinian, romantic partnerships, business partnerships, but there's also indifference. There's also condescension. There's fear. There's mistrust, all the way to open hatred. I can just give you sort of two examples of Israeli-run organizations that show you two very different places on the spectrum of how these two groups of people want to interact with one another, specifically Israelis towards Palestinians. On the one hand is a group called B'Tselem. B'Tselem coming from the Tanakh, from the Torah, from Genesis, where all people are made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And this idea of in the image, right, is it reflects the group's mission of equality and changing the status quo here in the working towards a two-state solution, but also a big tactic that they use is to take photos. B'Tselem is actually in the word salam, the shoresh, the root in Hebrew means photographer, and to photograph things. So this organization is anti-occupation, anti-Israeli presence in the West Bank. And this organization views Palestinians as full partners and allies in this struggle, right? So you have this one organization that represents one specific approach towards the Palestinians. Another Israeli organization called Lehava which is an organization that goes around the streets of Jerusalem. Not the only thing they do, but what they're known for is going around the streets of Jerusalem and attacking Arabs that are wandering the streets. If there are mixed couples, Arab and Jewish together, they've been known to engage them violently as well. And this is a group that openly states that they are against the mixing of Jews and Arabs in any way, shape, or form. Right? They use the word assimilation in Hebrew to say that we're against assimilation, but it plays out differently. So you have one group that is, it's about partnership and allyship and working together. And you have another group that there is no partnership. There is nothing to work together. What do you mean? There's nothing there. There's nothing between us and them. There's no reason to interact one with the other. And of course, I'm sure you can imagine just from the description that these two groups, the people who are active in them, obviously don't see eye to eye with one another, but it reflects this huge spectrum of how Israelis view Palestinians. But I will say that some of the things that have happened in the past years, what we do see is there's a lot of questioning that if there really is a partner for peace on the other side. Again, I'm speaking here about Israeli attitudes. I don't know public polling from the Palestinian side. I'm always reticent of Western organizations that go in and poll in Palestinian society because just like if you're going to run a poll in Israel, you need to do it in Hebrew and ask the right questions and have access to people. The same thing needs to be done for these questions to mean to take great lessons from polls. But you see that at least in the Israeli side, there's a lot of reticence. There's a lot of this feeling, okay, we could make peace, but we don't know with whom, and we're not really sure that person exists at the moment. So I'd say that is not I wouldn't say that's more than 50% of people would speak like this, but I would say that's one of the wider, one of the feelings that's experienced by more people. This sort of feeling of, well, we could do something if there was just someone to shake hands with on the other side. The last part of this question was about Palestinian, the politics of 1948 Arabs. In 1948 Arabs, what I mean is any Arab who was living within the borders of Israel when it was established in 1948 at the end of the Independence War with the armistice deals in the summer, of 1949. So all of those Arabs living in Israel that have full citizenship, again, it's a broad spectrum of political ideologies. You have people that are, you have communists, you have Islamists, you have left-wing thinkers, right-wing thinkers. The one thing that really does unite internal, 1948 Arab politics is the opposition to Israel's occupation, Israel's presence in the West Bank. And I think many of them would also say Israel's influence on the Gaza Strip, which we'll talk about both in more detail here shortly. All of these, what unites ideologically most Arab voters in Israel is a opposition to Israeli presence in the West Bank. All right. So that was that first round of questions. If something didn't make sense, please feel free to pass it along in the chat. I'll be happy to answer. And if not, we'll just keep moving because I want to make sure that I'm getting to as much as I can today. So I beg your pardon. I'll put this into slideshow in a moment here. I just make sure we can see it here. All right. So the next question was, what efforts are being done today to bring the two population groups together? And how effective are these efforts? Can old wounds ever be overcome, or do they remain an obstacle for peace? It's a really lovely, very beautifully worded question and put together. So thank you. And when we talked about efforts for bringing Israelis and Palestinians together, much of this work is being done at the grassroots organizational level. You have, organizations like, maybe you've heard of something like a Seeds for Peace or the YMCA Youth Choir, where it's getting together primarily young people. Or another example that doesn't get together young people, I'm going to blank on its name, but it's an organization that brings together families who have lost people due to the conflict, both Arabs and Jews, particularly parents that have lost children, and brings them into focus groups and to discussion and sharing and therapy to work through the trauma that they've experienced and try to work so that it doesn't happen to other families. There's hundreds of ways to be involved. Both, thank you, Lee, the Parent Circle. It's a wonderful organization. I've heard speakers from them several times. It's a very powerful experience. They're incredibly brave to undergo the journey to move past the rage and the anger and the hurt that so many feel, to work towards a shared safer future for other people's children. The problem is that there's simply not enough of these organizations. The last 20 years, as we spoke about in last session, have led to really big gaps, both physically, right? We talked about last week, 2 weeks ago, excuse me, we talked about the security barrier being built, right, which physically separated Palestinian and Israeli communities. But I think a lot of the events of the past 20 years have also separated culturally, whereas when these two communities want to meet, all too often it demands both sides move to somewhere else, right? Sometimes it can be in an Arab community or a Jewish community, but sometimes it demands both sides, and so there's just not enough of these efforts being made. And this stagnation in building these connections, both informal and formal, means that in the times of crisis, right, even when things perhaps are getting better, or that each side tends to move back into their respective corners, right, the safest space for them that they've known. And then at the end of each crisis, everything needs to get started up again. So many of these organizations working, for example, last May, groups that work to get Arabs and Jews together. The fear and the panic and the confusion in the wake of the events of May really put a hold on a lot of those things, as people had to question, do I feel comfortable doing this? Is this where I want to be right now? And things have started back up, but it's slow. If you allow me to just sort of wax and be more of a prognosticator rather than a historian for a moment. And I think these, if we can work towards critical masses of people who demand this change on both sides, but it's slow work, it's hard work, but there, that said, there's some incredible things being done. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question. Okay, so settlements. All right, I got several questions about settlements, and so I've summed them up into how did they develop? What did certain governments do to support settlement development or not do to support settlement development? And who are the settlers? So it's an incredibly interesting topic. Most things I've discussed in these past weeks, I find it to be amazing. On the document that I will share through Rabbi Landsberg, of a source sheet, I've included an article that you can find that really walks you through the history of the settlement movement. But just to give a few thoughts and to put some things into context. So I think when we hear the word settlements, the image that pops to mind is a religious man, probably male, Jewish, very noticeably outwardly Jewish, right, with the signs of a religious practicing Jew, armed, maybe religiously zealous, aggressive towards the Palestinians. And while those images may have once rung true and really spoken to the ideological vanguard of the settler movement, what's happened over the last decades has really changed what it is to be a settler, who they are. And it doesn't really reflect the majority of settlers. So just really quickly, again, 1948, it sets territorial boundaries of the Jewish state. between 48 and 1967, there's very little interest in any sort of territorial expansion, except, of course, the places on the far left and far right of the political spectrum. But no one in the Israeli leadership and the government is motivated to have any sort of territorial expansion. A lot is made historically. People, try to make a case to show that Israel always had this master plan to take over these territories, and it's not the case. It's not what the record reflects, and it's just not true. Israel was dealing with enough internally where it didn't want to deal with this. 1967, the borders changed. It's been called by an Israeli historian and thinker named Micha Goodman as the Catch 67, where Levi Eshkol, the prime minister at the time, summed it up best when he said, "The dowry pleases you, but the bride does not." Right? The dowry meaning safer borders, right? More territory between Israel and its sworn enemies, but the bride does not, right? What comes with the dowry, what comes with these land, these people that Israel had no interest in having any sort of sovereignty over. Israel doesn't know what to do with these territories. As I mentioned previously, the three no's famously given by the Arab League at the Khartoum conference in 1967 after the war, that says no to peace, no to negotiations, no to recognition. Israeli leadership at the time sees that the idea of land for peace is impossible. Israel does annex parts of the land, East Jerusalem, later the Golan, and for the time being, it leaves Palestinians and Bedouins and Druze living under very minimal Druze, but Palestinians and Bedouins living under Israeli control in the newly acquired territories, living under martial law. Even so, basically no one during this time, between 67 and 73, there's not a movement of people into the settlements. A small group of left-wing kibbutznikim that were the children of the founders of Gush Etzion, which is a block of communities south of Jerusalem, asked for permission to go back, and the government granted that. A small group of Jews goes into Hebron after there had not been a Jewish community in Hebron since 1948, because the Jordanians had pushed them out. But the Yom Kippur War, which we haven't really even spoken about here, is what really pushes the settlement project forward. And the Yom Kippur War almost brings Israel to its knees. I'm sure there are people in this call that remember the feelings of those times, really thinking that Israel might not survive. And the economic downturn, the spiritual and economic downturn that comes in the wake of the war, really pushes individuals and groups to start thinking about territorial integrity and defense. And then also the government looking for answers, economic answers to war-weary and citizens and economically harmed citizens. The group that is credited with starting this settlement enterprise, Gush Emunim, the Block of the Believers, is founded in 1974, and they start to found communities in the West Bank, Gaza, and Sinai. The Labor government at that time, led by Golda Meir and then Yitzhak Rabin in his first prime ministership, reprimands these groups, but does very little to stop them. This small number. In 1977 in Israel, there's a political earthquake, what's called in Hebrew the Mahapach, the flipping over, where the left-wing political parties, which have been in control for the first 30 years of Israel's existence, lose at the ballot box. The Likud, then led by Menachem Begin, sweeps into power, together with Mafdal, which was the National Religious Party in its form at that time. And it brings these two political parties to power. So on one hand, under Menachem Begin, you have peace with Egypt, where he clears out the Sinai settlements of Israelis. He gives the land back to Egypt on behalf of peace. On the other hand, what happens under his governments is that the quasi-state bodies that exist here in Israel, the World Zionist Organization, the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, other groups, other similar groups, that have more influence now underneath, or have more ideological influence from the parties in power, the Likud and the Mafdal, the National Religious, start to work on further expansion of settlements in Gaza, Golan, and the West Bank. just very quickly, through the years, from that point, really the face of it all changes, because in the 1980s, the settlements that are built are settlements right along the green line, the armistice line between Jordan and Israel. I'll show you a map in a minute here, just so you see what I mean, or I'll show you a few maps. And these really are, first of all, these are mixed communities, secular and religious. Most of the people living there commute to either Jerusalem or to Haifa or to Tel Aviv for work. So these are more suburban enclaves where you beat the crush of the city, and you find cheaper housing, which is a problem then and is an even more dire issue now. Finally, 1980s, the first ultra-Orthodox settlement was founded. So what is seen as sort of vanguarded by this group of hardline believers, it's true, they're still there and they exist, but they were only very briefly the majority of people living in what's called settlements. The 90s was actually the largest decade of growth of settlements under the Yitzhak Shamir right-wing government, the Yitzhak Rabin left-wing government, and then the Netanyahu right-wing government in the late 90s. During these years, there's about 100,000 people that move into settlements. That's a little bit less than a fourth of how many Israelis are located there today. It's over 400,000 Israeli citizens living in the West Bank. I'm sorry I'm moving quickly, but I want to make sure that we can get to the other issues that people brought up. In 2005, the disengagement. Sharon pulls 8,000 Jews, 8,000 Israelis out from the 21 settlements in Gaza. And that disengagement is sort of the last great movement or big geopolitical, geographical change when it comes to settlements, of the last decades. And what happened in Gaza in the wake, where Hamas takes over and indiscriminate rocket fire towards Israeli civilian centers, sort of takes the idea of land for peace, is irreparably harmed by that change. The last decade of Netanyahu governments have been interesting. There's actually been no new settlements that have been built in the last decade. The only Israeli prime minister to ever agree to American pressure to freeze building and settlements. They did, I believe, the freeze was in place for 18 or 20 months as negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, and I want to say 2010 were being carried out. But when there was some building was done, what's called the E1 corridor, and I'll show it to you in a second, which is between Ramallah and Jerusalem, which would effectively cut off any sort of travel between Arab Jerusalem and Ramallah, which of course the Palestinians see as a huge issue, almost a casus belli, and almost a call to action, if that would be cut off. So let's look really quickly here. I have a couple of maps where I just want to show you what I'm talking about here. Oh goodness, excuse me, sorry about the technical difficulties. Okay, so the first map is this map, which was going to show us, which will show us the change of building of West Bank. These are all maps according to the part of the Washington Institute. Oh, this is the Economic Cooperation Forum. The link to these will be in the resource document that I'll send to Rabbi Landsberg after this session. And what we can see here is that this is the West Bank. You can see Jerusalem here in the middle, Ramallah, what I just referenced here. E1 is part of the area right in here, which we'll zoom into in a second. But just to show you, so between 1967 and 1977, and I apologize that I'm hoping this will be clear enough for you, but you might need to get a little bit closer to your screen. You can see here, everything that just popped up on your screen is a blue settlement, right? Was built between 1967 and 1977. So just to point out a couple of things. First of all, the Jordan Valley, this area here, you can start to see these small settlements, right? This is sort of in security terms for Israel, the Jordan Valley is a place that we cannot compromise, right? This is key to the security of the Israeli state. So Jordan Valley, you also start to see most of the building is going on here around Jerusalem, both inside the municipal boundaries, which you can see here, these dotted lines. Maybe I'll can I, oh good, I can zoom in a bit, right? You can see here in areas of Jerusalem, Beit Hanina, French Hill, these are all parts of Jerusalem, right? But are still by international law considered settlements. This is where it becomes, more complex, is because Israel does not consider these to be settlements. Neither does America, the United States of America, after the Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and recognized Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem. Another type of settlement, Ma'ale Adumim, which today is its own city. You can see it's built outside of Jerusalem. Today, there's something around 45 or 55,000 people in Ma'ale Adumim. It's a huge, it's a great alternative for families that don't want to spend the money to live in Jerusalem. 77 to 84. So now we're talking about the Menachem Begin years. So 1977 to 1984. You can see once again, just to move the remove before settlements, right? You can see that there's quite a few communities that are built during these years, as I mentioned. The Begin governments were quite supportive of the effort. The city of Ariel today, which is much bigger, houses one of Israel's 5 universities and Israel's 5th medical school here in Ariel. 1984 to 1988. We'll add this layer. All right, only a small piece. Again, if you can see, again, most of the settlements that are built are quite close to the Green Line. There are, of course, settlements here in the Jordan Valley and farther out, but the majority of building is here around the Green Line. And what you're going to start to see is that from 1988 until 2014, that most of what's built is expansion of already existing blocks. So the Ma'ale Adumim block, the Modi'in Elite block, this one here just over the Green Line that borders the city of Modi'in that I'm sure many of you have visited here. So as we add layers, right, up until 90, up until 92, up until 2001, right, most of it is not being new construction. You could see that a few new communities are created. But even that change from 2001 to 2014, there's almost nothing new built. It's only a growing population in each of these settlements. What I want to invite you to do is to use that map of the Economic Cooperation Forum Foundation, this map from the Washington Institute, which will allow you to go around to it. Well, first of all, it'll show you, excuse me for 1 second here, you can add different layers. So we can start with, if we want to, we can add all the Palestinian communities in the West Bank, right? So everything that just popped up in yellow, these are all Palestinian communities. We'll zoom in a bit here, right? And then you can add on top, what will come up in blue is Israeli settlements. The blue being neighborhoods around Jerusalem. Again, these are contested as to whether they're settlements or not. And you see the large blocks here of Israeli communities spread out over the West Bank. You can also break it down. Like I said, most of the building is in certain blocks. So these are when we talk about peace negotiations and only building inside of settlement blocks. This is what is being, that's what the lingo is. That each one of these is sort of its own little area, and there's a lot of different ways to come and see, right? To look at Jerusalem, which is especially complex, and we might not, unfortunately I don't know how much time we'll have to discuss it today, but you have Western Jerusalem, you have the Jewish quarter, which is across the Green Line, and in the old city of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, the Hebrew University, all of these neighborhoods, Ramat Elon and Ramat Shlomo, which are Jewish neighborhoods, French Hill, which is a Jewish neighborhood, but I know I have professors and people I know that where this is a mixed neighborhood. It's Jews and Arabs living together. Beit Hanina, Jewish, Palestinian, Shuafat, Palestinian, and so this mishmash of neighborhoods in Jerusalem, which it's a wonderful tapestry of human diversity, and it's a beautiful thing, but it also can be the flashpoint of some of the challenges. The third map that I'd encourage you to look at is B'Tselem, the organization I mentioned earlier, and this is while the ECF and the Washington Institute are nonpartisan, they don't take a stand on these issues. B'Tselem is very openly anti-occupation. And so you'll see how different things get different attention and things are listed differently. So I encourage people to go on and to look at these issues and compare. I just want to quote one piece to finish up our settlements, then I'll move on to really the thing that was most asked about. The author of the article that I mentioned, Syria-El Hirshhorn, who's I believe she's at Baylor or Butler, wrote that, quote, more disconcerting is the dwindling support amongst both Israel, more disconcerting than the building of more settlements or the settlements itself, is the dwindling support amongst both Israelis and Palestinians for a two-state solution and the advancement of one-state discourse by leadership on both sides. Today, the locus of conflict seems to be less about whether there are viable strategies for the division of territory, but whether both sides envision their state as occupying all the land and people between the river and the sea. The mainstreaming of these maximalist objectives are the ultimate triumph of the history and politics of the Israeli settler movement over the past 5 decades. So rather than the settlements themselves as this sort of boundary, how I read this as the author is that the maximalism that is brought out of both sides is counterproductive to any sort of future solution, right? You hear from Israeli maximalists that say, we'll never kick Jews out of another settlement. Jews won't ever ever force Jews to leave their homes. And you hear from Palestinian leadership that says the Palestinian state will not welcome settlers, which means they won't welcome Jews as part of the Palestinian state. So you have these maximalist positions, which make coming to any sort of agreement even more difficult. Last but certainly not least is the subject that I was asked about the most in these questions, and that's the idea of in the amnesty report, which was just released last week. So let's start with this word apartheid. It's an incredibly powerful term because of what it represents, and the global effort to fight it is alive in so many of our collective memories. It's also a very intellectually simple term, right? We all know that apartheid, anyone that practices apartheid is bad, and if you want to be on the side of good, you oppose apartheid. Beg your pardon. Which, and this idea fits into a greater political discourse globally that has, one, polarized, so either you are on the right or wrong side of an issue, and two, it plays on social media. So we're apartheid, get people's attention and break through all the noise and all the cacophony of sound that we have on our social media outlets. But let's look at the term first and foremost at its most basic level. So apartheid, the system, is a set of laws devised by the Afrikaner Party when it comes to power in 1948 in South Africa. It categorized people into certain racial groups and prohibited the mixing of these groups in almost all settings. Separate school systems, the right to vote for people of color was taken away through the years. There's no such law that exists in Israel itself or any territory where Israel has sovereignty at the moment, permanent or temporary. This doesn't exist anywhere, right? This is not the situation on the ground. The term itself, when I read the word apartheid, just as I encourage you all at the beginning of this session, is that it takes a Western paradigm, right, and it places around a conflict that didn't develop in the West, nor does it play out in the West. What it does, it takes the idea of apartheid is about categorizing people into races and then separating these races, right? And there's simply not the same context in this conflict here. The discrimination of Palestinians exists, right? And we'll talk about this, right? We're going to get to right now. But it's not primarily based on their belonging to a certain race of people. There's a lot more context in history that goes beyond how things have played out for the Palestinians than there is than to just say it's because Israelis are white, Palestinians are not white, and therefore that's the power dynamic. It's just not true. Israelis aren't all, some are, they look white, most of them are not white, not coming from European backgrounds. And so, I shouldn't have even gone down that road because it's just not, race is not the framework in which this conflict, the the primary impetus or influence on this conflict is not race, which we see in North America is one of part of our collective histories. So that's sort of looking at the term itself, but of course there's a different way to read the term. All right, so let's try to take it as if the people who are using it are they're good actors, right? They really care about what they're talking about. Let's give them all the benefit of the doubt for a moment. And when we read this term, let's read it as another word for discrimination. So then the question is, does discrimination against Palestinians in Israel or its territories, and like everything we've been dealing with, there are different answers to that. In Gaza, everything internally in Gaza is controlled by Hamas. Israel and Egypt control the borders, right? Which puts Gazans into an economic vice grip because everything that comes in and out with the permission of someone else, right? You don't have, there's no control over those borders because of security reasons for both Egypt and Israel. That said, Israel doesn't control what happens in Gaza, right? They're not telling Hamas how they need to work towards problem. They don't dictate anything. So apartheid just doesn't have any relevance here. East Jerusalem and the Golan, these are annexed territories, part of Israel according to Israeli law, according to the United States, according to international law. These are still disputed. For Arabs living in these areas, there's a path to citizenship, albeit a very complicated one. And many of them are also reluctant to take it because of personal or familial pressure not to become a citizen of Israel. And one need really only walk through my part of Jerusalem where I live now in Western Jerusalem, and then walk into the eastern part of the city. And it's pretty easy to see the disparity in city funding. Like, you don't need to be a genius to know that one place is getting investment and the other is getting less investment. Myriad reasons, of course. Is this a problem? 100%, right? It needs to be fixed. Right? We need to have equity handed out and people's neighborhoods improved. But as apartheid, it's not. Arab Israelis, again, the same group of 48 Israelis that I mentioned, they enjoy full civil rights in Israel. Now, they do face discrimination. We'll just be very honest with one another. One example of a discriminatory rule that really only affects Arab Israelis and not Jewish Israelis is that if I, as an Israeli citizen, marry a non-Israeli citizen, I can get that person's citizenship or a green card pretty easily. If I'm an Arab and I marry a Palestinian from either Gaza Strip or the West Bank, that person is not entitled to Israeli citizenship through that marriage, right? It's a law that's called the citizenship law. It comes from during the time of the Second Intifada to limit entry into Israel from the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where most of the terror attacks were being planned and equipped. And it's still in effect today, that law. And the biggest difference is economics. So the question, what efforts have been made since 1948 to integrate Palestinian Israelis into the economy? There haven't been much. It's really, really disparate amounts of money invested into the Palestinian sector, into schools, into roads, into neighborhoods. There's not been a single Arab community founded in Israel since the birth of the country, as opposed to dozens of Jewish neighborhoods. Now, these places weren't necessarily built so only Jews could live there, but that's effectively who's living there. And there hasn't been expansion or building of new communities for Arab citizens of Israel since the state was founded. If you live in an Arab area, it can be harder to get connected to the electrical grid, harder to get building permits. And then if you build illegally, the illegal building is more closely watched by the Israeli government, and so things get demolished. And so these are all problems. Also discrimination in seeking apartments or employment. You hear stories all the time. They show up, the conversations in Hebrew, somebody catches an accent, and then immediately, the story, maybe this apartment isn't for you for whatever reason. These are anecdotal, but they all add up. Not to say this is a problem, there's discrimination in Israel like there is anywhere. Also, Jews from the former Soviet Union, Ethiopian Jews, Mizrahi Jews experience some of this discrimination, but it's there for Arabs and Palestinians. That said, within the system, Arabs, Bedouins, and Druze, these minorities, these Arabic-speaking minorities, they serve at every level of the government. We've had many firsts for Arab Israelis in this current government, like new positions and government ministers and all that, which is a very interesting experiment in Israeli democracy. Every level of the judiciary, the army, academics, medicine, there are errors, right? There's no laws that keep people away, but we know that discrimination exists. So it's there. So is there discrimination? Yes. Apartheid? No. West Bank. This one is the most difficult, all right? Most Palestinians live in areas A, right, which is under complete Palestinian Authority control. They can move freely between the areas A and B, so there's fewer checkpoints. They can get to work in Israel. And so the people who have more connection to the Israeli economy have better job prospects, higher paying job prospects. Palestinians living in Area C, which is under full Israeli control, which means they cross checkpoints on a daily basis to leave their village to get where they need to go, to come back to their village, which can be, for some, it can be a 15-minute experience. For others, it can be more than, it can be hours, right? These things can shut down if the security situation worsens or if there's a threat in the area, and which makes mobility difficult. Area C is where most violence occurs between Palestinians and settlers, or vice versa, settlers and Palestinians. And the government's enforcement of laws on its surface seems many times more balanced for Jews than the Arab, for Israeli citizens than Arabs living there. Yet the Palestinians, because they are living under military law and they're not Israeli citizens, they can't turn to the Israeli judiciary to deal with civilian problems that they have in Area C. They have to go to the Israeli military courts, which have a completely different level of scrutiny, to use, if we're talking about legalese here, have different sets of laws and how to enforce them, and so it's not the same recourse that Israeli citizens have. Palestinians have access to all the same supermarkets and gas stations and doctors, so there's not a separation of services, but there are effectively two systems of law in the same area of land. And what just considers that, are you an Israeli civilian, which means in Area C, are you a Jew, or are you a Palestinian? And now, is this precisely the definition of apartheid? No, but it's a really troubling reality. And it's one of the hallmarks of democratic rule, right? And advanced societies and societies that take their civilians and the residents' needs into consideration. If one of the hallmarks of that is democratic rules, that there's one law for everyone, it's certainly not the case in the West Bank. Oh man, there's just so I realize that I'm short on time here, but I really just a few more things to say, and then I'll jump to the end. So when you're looking at we've sort of looked at it at the basic level, right? Is there apartheid? Is there not apartheid? But let's really go beyond, apartheid with yes or no, and especially in this most recent context, which is the Amnesty International report on Israel-Palestine, in which it called all of Israeli territory, West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, all of Israel 48 borders, all one apartheid regime. And when they say that, what do they really mean? They really mean that a country should be made a pariah, as was done to South Africa. I linked to it in the document that I'll send, but the Union for Reform Judaism, the URJ's response, I thought was very well put together and balanced in responding to Amnesty. And so a few basic points that the URJ pointed out, which I want to reflect here because I think they smartly point out the problems in this report. The first is that the report includes stories and figures that have been proven to be untrue. If you want to go through the full thing, you can go to the website and they'll give you the information about what exactly is there. And it leaves any sort of recognition of Israeli security concerns out. There's no nuance of Israeli concerns or safety or anything like that. It doesn't exist. It's not even there even once in the report. A second point is that apartheid is a false equivalence that will be used by those already opposed to Israel to further anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic tropes, right? The using apartheid when it's not true is only going to empower those who are already virulently anti-Israel. And within the report, Amnesty calls to bring back all refugees, all Palestinian refugees into Israel, which would challenge, Israel's existence as a Jewish state, supports BDS and other similar steps abroad, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, for those of you who are not familiar, that looks to boycott Israel and anything Israeli around the world. It places Israel's founding as the cause of apartheid, and it gives zero responsibility or really zero agency to the Palestinians, right? Passive actors, right? No control over their own destiny. And so those points made at the ERJ really comes together. It says that Amnesty, they made a choice to not take Israeli concerns and lives into consideration. And all these elements of the Amnesty report strongly suggest that they deny any sort of legitimacy to a Jewish connection to the land of Israel and are challenging the very legitimacy of the existence of that Jewish state. And that's true, and that's not just me speaking with other people that, smart people to try to listen to, but also, it's hard not to arrive to that conclusion when you go through this document, how it's put together, what it includes, what it doesn't include. But the question is why, right? What's going on here? And there's one possible explanation that Rabbi Josh Weinberg, who's the head of Arts USA, provided when he received a text message from a friend that works at Amnesty. A full link to his op-ed will be in the document as well. And the friend wrote him from Amnesty, quote, "There is a clear internal bias against Israel that is not even masked. Israel is the only country that came up twice in an annual publication of human rights abuses around the world, including China, North Korea, and some of the worst places and cases imaginable. Your statement is taking the wrong approach," meaning the URJ statement. "Yes, it is important to refute the report based on its arguments and not just sink into the cheap repudiation of bias, anti-Semitism, whataboutism, etc. However, the report is pretty accurate, save for the apartheid claim, and its details are verifiable. Furthermore, Amnesty will not pay attention to any of you," and this is where it gets interesting to me, "to any of your critiques at all. All the statements and reactions of the Jewish world will not only fall on deaf ears, but actually make the Amnesty staff smirk and joke about all the Jewish organizations who now appear to be apartheid sympathizers. For legacy human rights organizations like Amnesty, throwing Israel under the bus has become the quick ticket to proving one's human rights street cred, especially among young people. It is much easier and more convenient to say free Gaza or Palestine than criticize the murderous record of, say, Syria, Iran, China, or any of the vilest and oppressive regimes on the planet." So the idea that throwing Israel under the bus is a quick ticket into proving someone's human rights commitment, and how this happened is a really complex web to unweave, which you don't have time. But as it stands, that's the situation. That's the niche that Amnesty is pushing their product towards. And as a word that came up earlier, I view this Amnesty report as a maximalist position, right? That takes a side that says one side is responsible for all of the pain, the suffering, everything that's happened in this conflict. One side has no responsibility, so we need to punish the side that has responsibility. It's a maximalist position, right? And it's not what's in here. It's not a maximalist position taken by Israelis or Palestinians, but it's a maximalist position taken by an international body whose stated mission is to be an honest reporter of human rights abuses. So the issue that arises for Amnesty and organizations like it is that when your claims don't reflect truth, your reputation is called into question, and you distance people who might otherwise support the important work that organizations do, right? Where they go into places and they report on things that are happening that we hope and pray will cease in our world during our lifetime, quickly in our time, in our days, in our lives. But the other challenge is Israel's legitimacy, and that's something that's really for someone who believes wholeheartedly in our legitimacy, in our claim to this land, and our right as a nation to have a state and a homeland of our own. It's really dangerous. So skip right to the end here, because I know we have to wrap, but you have been very patient and giving of my 75 minutes that I allocated here, but I really do want to get us to the end. So someone very graciously gave me the opportunity to answer the $1 million question, which is, what do you believe would be a good and fair solution to this conflict? Given that there are many non-Jews living in Eretz Israel, right? There are people that are in this land that are not Jewish and don't recognize this, and I don't know if it's a good solution, but again, you'll forgive me if I sort of wax poetic here for a moment. What I see as a fair solution is something that reflects, that recognizes people's legitimacy, my legitimacy to feel the way I feel when I look at the hills of Jerusalem and think about the Psalms of King David, in a way that doesn't delegitimize the feeling that my Palestinian, cousins have when they move around this land and they tell the stories of their ancestors. A fair solution doesn't give either side what it wants, all that it wants. A fair solution ensures Israel's security and Palestinian sovereignty, and it demands compromise and bravery that I know exists, but it can be hard to put into practice. And so, we could spend weeks and months on these topics and these issues and go into a whole different world, but, I'll leave my comments about the conflict and bring those to an end now. And I just want to end as a future rabbi, Bezrat Hashem, God willing, one day soon, I'd like to end on just a small piece of Torah, because that's just, it's the Jewish way to end a conversation. I'll just share it with you quickly. It's a piece from it's a piece of Midrash. It comes from Leviticus Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah, and it's a parable. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai tells a parable about the Jewish people. Men were on a ship. One of them took a drill and started drilling underneath him. The other said to him, "What are you sitting and doing?" He replied, "What do you care? Is this not underneath my area that I'm drilling?" And they said to him, "But the water will rise and flood us all on this ship." So again, that's just a short midrash, and what I find really meaningful and lovely in these days of crisis and uncertainty is that what I take from this lesson, I keep bringing it back over and over to remind myself that as members of the Jewish people, you and I and our friends and our loved ones and the people that we don't agree with, we're all on the same ship. Even though at times it doesn't feel that way, it feels like we're separated. And it's so important to come together when Israel isn't necessarily in the headlines, and to learn about who we are and where we come from and where we might be able to go. As members of the human race, many times we sail together, sometimes with unexpected guests and crowds, and the deeds of some can drastically change the circumstances of the other. And I'll just leave you all with, may we be blessed with the strength and the ability to work side by side with those on our ship, so we may all reach our destination in peace. Huge thank you to you, Rabbi Landsberg, for inviting me. A huge thank you also to you, Lee, for inviting me. And a huge, huge, huge thank you to all of you. It was a pleasure to bring you this knowledge. It was a pleasure to do all the work and preparation. It was just so much fun to learn and relearn and challenge myself. So I hope you walk away with more questions. And I really do hope this is just the beginning of the dialogue between me and all the wonderful people here. So I wish you health and safety. Again, thank you so much. And Lee and Rabbi, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Josh. It was such a rich series of sessions that you did for us. And I know that it felt a bit rushed because you were trying to squish so much into a short time. So, maybe we'll be able to have you back in the future. But I really want to thank you for all the work and research that you did to bring us such a comprehensive understanding of the history and the situation today. And there's obviously lots more to discuss, but thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I want to mention that if anybody is interested in other Arts of Canada programming and you're not on our mailing list, you can contact me, and I'll put my email address in the chat. Thank you. Rabbi?
And I want to thank the both of you, Lee, for all you do with Arts of Canada and for working with us jointly to present this. Josh, it will be a privilege when I get to call you my rabbinic colleague. It is, you do the Jewish people proud and you do the Reform movement proud. So thank you so much for spending your Sunday evenings with us. And we look forward to more ongoing learning and conversation with everyone. Emanu-El next Sunday's Reading with the Rabbi, People Love Dead Jews by Dara Horn. I hope you get a chance to read some of her essays. Different subject, but again, we continue our conversations in the many ways that we do. And for all who've joined us, we will forward on the resource sheet that Josh will send to us. We'll get it as soon as we have it. And thank you so much. And let's see each other in peace and in health, and God willing, in 3D sometime soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.